Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on getting ready for IR35. My name is Jazz Duty. I'm one of the directors here at MTax, and thank you for joining us at today's live presentation. Now, before I commence, just to let you know that at the bottom of the screen, you have got a question and answer panel. So if you want to fire any questions, there will be time at the end where I should be able to give you the answers that you require. So without further ado, let's get cracking on how to get ready for IR35. Okay, so let's have a look at the latest news. Well, I think we were all severely disappointed, that the IR35 reforms were all delayed at the very last minute back in March 2020. And obviously that's because of the COVID crisis. So these have been postponed by 12 months, so they're going to come into force in April 2021, in just under 3 months' time. Now, prior to April 2020, some larger employers had already issued a blanket ban on personal service companies. We say that this is the incorrect approach. If you do decide to go down this route, you will lose some of your best contractors. And it's also unnecessarily expensive, we feel, because with enough forward planning, adhering to these reforms is definitely achievable. So a quick recap on HMRC's estimates. They know that there's about 500,000 personal service company contractors out there being paid via their own companies. And they only expect to catch about a third of them. 30% is how many they expect are going to be deemed to be employees. So that still leaves over 2/3 as continuing to be paid via invoices, being self-employed. But if you want to achieve anywhere near these numbers, you must be prepared to change your contracts and your working conditions to keep as many contractors outside of IR35 as possible. So a quick recap on employment status and why it matters. Obviously, there is a big difference in terms of national insurance that is payable, whether you classify a worker to be an employee or whether they're self-employed. Employees have no choice. The money is taken often before they get it via pay-as-you-earn, whereas self-employed pay once a year at the end of January via self-assessment. It's easier to deduct expenses from your profits if you are self-employed, whereas it's much more difficult for an employee to claim for expenses. But the big differential is the Class 1 employers' national insurance. That's the additional cost that employers have to pay, the 13.8% additional cost that you have to pay if the worker is deemed to be an employee. So let's go through the core employment status tests. The first one is there a personal service required of the worker to deliver the services? And going along with that is, has a mutuality of obligation arisen? I'll talk a little bit more about mutuality of obligation on the next slide. That's a core test. The other core test is control. So what is being expected of the worker? How they're going to deliver it, how much supervision, direction or control is going to be imposed on them. Typically, if it's an experienced contractor, you just tell them what to do, they agree to do it, and then they go away and do it themselves with little or no supervision. If that's the case, they're more likely to be self-employed. Also, where and when the services are delivered is important. If you expect the worker to be on site, we can keep an eye on them, well, that displays a level of control, which will mean that they're more likely to be an employee. And also what are their hours of work? It may be that they have to be on site so that they can access other staff members, for example, if they're administering your network, in which case that's unavoidable. But where and when they deliver the services is important in terms of control. And what you have to do is look at all the other factors as well and weigh up on what side of the scales a particular worker falls, whether they're to be deemed to be self-employed or employed, by weighing up the different employment status factors. So a little bit more about mutuality of obligation. This arises where the worker is personally obliged to perform some work for the engager. And then the engager is obliged to pay the worker for that work. Now, you can argue, or HMRC argue, that every single contract incurs a mutuality of obligation, but in real life and in case law, it's longevity is what matters. For example, you could bring someone in for 3 months to deliver on a particular stage of a project, and then they'll go away, never see them again. Whereas that's okay, they can continue to be self-employed on that basis if all the other factors stack up as well. However, if that same worker is still working for you 5 years later, and they've not worked for any other client in that period of time, then it's almost definitely going to be classified as an employee because a mutuality of obligation is deemed to have arisen. Now, the other factors, are they in business on their own account? So do they have all the trappings of trade? Do they have a website, letterhead, business premises, those kinds of things? Who provides the equipment? Hopefully it's them. Obviously, if they have to access your IT, so you give them a laptop, that can be argued for security reasons, but major equipment should be provided by themselves. Then how much financial risk do they take? Do they ever have non-payment of bills? Do they have to come back and put things right if they've done a job wrong at their own cost that you're not going to pay for? All these things show the degree of financial risk they're undertaking. Importantly, do they or are they allowed to carry out jobs for other clients at the same time? Having multiple clients that they are providing services to in the same period is a massive indicator towards self-employment. Then there's part and parcel. How do they look externally? Do they look different from your employees? Do they look like the part and parcel of your business, or are they easily identifiable as being in business in their own right? So these are all the factors, as well as mutuality of obligation, personal service, and control, that have to be weighed up before you can decide whether or not someone is going to be employed or self-employed. So just a reminder of the current off-payrolling rules, and these are the ones that apply to the public sector at this moment in time. Now, IR35 has been around for over 20 years, but compliance was very, very low, and HMRC only ever undertook 450 investigations in any given year. That was the maximum number of investigations they ever undertook. So obviously there was a hell of a lot of contractors not complying with the rules. So in April 2017, the off-payroll rules were first brought in to affect public sector bodies. And this has led to over £500 million of additional income tax and national insurance from workers providing services into the public sector who were deemed to be employees. Obviously, HMRC judged this as a success, and which is why it's now being rolled out to the private sector. But obviously, there was that 12-month delay. It was expected to raise £1.2 billion in this current fiscal year if it had gone ahead in April. So if after conducting your self-employed employment status test to see which side of the scales the worker falls on, it was deemed that the worker would be an employee, then the fee payer, that would be the public sector body, would be treated as the employer of the worker, and they would have to deduct tax, national insurance, and the apprenticeship levy from invoices that were presented to them. This would be classified as their employment income of the worker, and it would be reported to HMRC via RTI. However, they're not deemed to be employees because no pensions or statutory payments or student loans are applicable on these payments. And it's safe to say that almost all public sector contractors were caught by this, because the public sector took the approach that to be safe than sorry to classify most of their contractors as being employees. So let's see what's changing for the private sector rollout. That's the rules that are coming in for this April. So now the concept of fee payer is being introduced across the board, unless the fee payer is a small private sector business. And the definition of small is your turnover is less than 10 million, your balance sheet is less than 5 million, you've got less than 50 employees. So if 2 out of 3 of those conditions apply, then you don't have to follow these rules. Everybody else, so it's medium, large private sector bodies and public sector bodies are now defined as fee payers from April 2021. And similar to what happened in the public sector, they are now responsible for deducting and accounting for all payroll taxes, that's income tax, national insurance, apprenticeship levy, from personal service workers, personal service company workers who are deemed to be employees. And you apply these deductions to their net or VAT invoices. So you still pay their VAT. It's just the net amount that you have to impose employment taxes on. Now, the fee payers are generally the end clients, but these responsibilities can be passed up the chain because HMRC understand and appreciate that you don't always engage with the personal service company direct. There may be agencies, a labour supply chain involved, but it is the responsibility of the engager, the client to whom the services are being delivered, to make a status determination statement. That's the fancy word for the employment status test, the assessment. And the end user of the services has to weigh up the determining factors that we mentioned before to decide whether that person, that worker, can be classified as being employed or self-employed. Now, this SDS must be given to the worker and also passed down the labour supply chain until it arrives at the entity responsible for paying the worker. Then the transfer of responsibility falls onto that fee payer. If the client, if you, the end user, fails to make an SDS or fails to pass it down the supply chain, then you remain the fee payer. So the responsibility remains with you. So you do need to find out the identity of the fee payers. So you should be, from now, making inquiries of who actually pays the worker and how many steps of the chain there are involved. This is so that you can make sure when you do make your status determination statements, they are passed down to the relevant body who's going to end up paying them. If it ends up that the fee payer is actually based offshore, then it's the next one in the chain who's based in the UK who's expected to deduct pay-as-you-earn from the income of the worker. So these status determination statements, I'll call them SDSs now because that's a bit of a mouthful. Now, you, the end user, have to make these SDSs taking reasonable care on how the employment status has been arrived at. Unfortunately, HMRC has not construed to give us any advice of what reasonable care actually means. Once this statement has been distributed, the worker has a right of appeal and you have to respond within 45 days. Now, that response could be that you decide the original SDS is correct, in which case you can just say, tough, that's that. Or you might take additional information on board and issue a revised status determination if you agree with the contentions of the worker. Now, one thing in your favor is if the worker or their representatives of the agencies tell you something which ends up being incorrect to skew the assessment towards self-employment, then a transfer of liability to the worker will then occur. So that means you're safeguarded. But if you fail to obey the 45-day limit, then you will be determined as the fee payer. So it's very important that you keep on top of this. And if any appeals come in, you have got a process in place to deal with them. So on to how you should be planning for IR35 reform, what you should be doing right now. Last year, many of you would have formed your IR35 project teams. And if you haven't already done so, I think you should reinstigate these now. So you should be inviting members from human resources, finance, payroll, legal department and procurement. And what you need to do is, first of all, identify who on your supplier list is a personal service company. And then you should be working out how you are going to produce these SDSs that are now legally required. What you need to decide in these project teams is what is best for your business. As I said at the outset, some large volume engagers, most of the major banks, late last year decided to just transfer everybody onto the payroll. They will take no more new contractors on board. If you do decide to go down this route, there will definitely be a brain drain. It's also going to cost you a lot more money. Some firms may decide just to move the work completely offshore, where IR35 does not apply. However, if you want to keep your overheads down, you'll have to pick the best testing methodology for your business. So what you need to do in all cases is, first of all, make sure your contracts are up to scratch. Then you also need to find out what's happening on the ground. So you do need to get the project team leaders out in the field to answer questions of what they know about the contractors who are working for them. So the idea of that is you need to not just what the contract stipulates, but hand in hand, the contract may say X, Y, Z, but ABC is what happens on the ground. So you need to marry the two up. Then once you've got that information, you can use various methods, which I'll talk about in a minute, of arriving at the SDS. But we think it's best to use HMRC status tool. And the reason for that is it's the only methodology that comes with any assurance from HMRC that they will stand by the result as long as you have been demonstrated to have taken reasonable care. And if you take the steps you mentioned before, the high-level review of the contract and get the project team leaders to answer questions about what actually happens on the ground, then as far as we're concerned, you have taken reasonable care. If the worker appeals, then you can get their factors, their personal factors introduced as well into the assessment, and then they may have a small bearing. But generally speaking, those two initial elements are enough to get an accurate SDS out of HMRC Success tool. And finally, you need to make sure that the system in place. You don't want to get caught out by missing the 45-day time limit to respond. And don't forget, you don't have to accept, to agree the appeal. You can just respond to it and say, no, we think our initial assessment is correct, and that's it. There's no further recourse to the worker if that's the case. And don't forget that from next year, this isn't a one-off exercise. Contractor will require an SDS, and new people you take on board. And existing contractors may need to be, and that example I gave before, someone you take on for 3 months who ends up being there for 2 years. They may well be self-employed, but you need to revisit that record, see what's going on after 12 months, say, and then that may be enough to flip them over to the employed status, because of the length of time they've been providing you services may have incurred a mutuality, in which case they will become employees. The system you choose will need used on a continual basis, and this is definitely not a one-off requirement. So what SDS methodology? Let's have a look to see what's out there. Now, there are a few commercially available SDS software packages out there, which charge you anything between £50 to £250. So they are expensive. And what you need to be aware is that they are not going to take any responsibility for arriving at an incorrect SDS. None of these are HMRC approved. The only approved methodology is HMRC Success tool. And some of these may also come with so-called HMRC investigation insurance, which fair enough of an investigation, but believe us, it's the amount of time these investigations take that you're not going to be with. They're very, very labor intensive, and they, from what, it's literally not to these kinds of arguments with HMRC. They've become very, very limited. You may decide to go down the manual assessment route, and this is something we totally are against. The reason for this is you probably haven't got the in-house expertise to do these properly. They do take a lot of time to go through all the questions that you have to, and to write and weigh up each answer. And they're potentially unreliable, even if you've got the best employment tax consultant out there. If they look at a set of circumstances on Monday morning and arrive at a decision and look at the same set of circumstances on Friday afternoon when they've been doing this all week, the more you can't guarantee that they'll arrive at the same result. And also they're very expensive as well, as you know, what consultants' time costs. So HMRC Success, back to this, it has been updated and we've had a good, and it's now much, much better than their initial offering. It is, which is, and I'll just repeat again, it's the only one that comes with any kind of HMRC assurance. So this is the methodology we recommend you use, because HMRC have promised to stand by the results as long as you've answered truthfully. So how can you improve the results? How can you keep as many contractors outside of IR35 as possible? Now, many of you will have contracts which will have a substitution clause in there. We've seen many of these, and in our opinion, a lot of these are substandard. They're not good enough. So you definitely need to put more definitions in your standard substitution clauses. You need to stipulate what would happen in real life if a substitution would actually occur. So firstly, you need to make sure the contractor is responsible for both finding and paying the substitute. You should not be involved. You should be the except anyone who worker should be able to provide. And then if a substitution has ever occurred in the past, then you can argue that this is not a sham clause. A precedent has been set. So that could apply across the board if it's ever happened. You need to move from a weekly hourly rate of pay to more of a project basis. So you need to be paying people at the completion of the project. So if you've got a long-term project, you need to split that up into stages. We recommend these stages to be no longer than 6 months. And in these contracts, you need to identify what's going to be delivered in that period of time. So you need a contract schedule or a statement of work for that 6-month period. And then you also need to ensure that the worker is not doing anything else outside of that contract schedule. These aren't your employees. They should only be there to deliver on the services that they've agreed to deliver and not be seconded off to do any other work which isn't been agreed to before. Another thing that you can do to differentiate from your contractors from employees is to stipulate a maximum number of hours or days that you agree to pay fees on. And the reason for this is employees will get paid regardless, whether they miss a deadline or not. Putting some kind of end date or a maximum number of days you are willing to pay for differentiates the worker from an employee. You could even, if there's any possibility of them exceeding the number of days, you can say, well, we agree to pay you a reduced penalty rate, say 50% the normal rate. And this again differentiates the contractor from the worker. Another thing you can do is to alternate the contractors. So once you've reached the end of one stage of a project, do not re-engage the same contractor for the next period. So having the contractor fend for themselves for a period of time negates any possibility of a mutuality of obligation having arisen. Similarly, don't have any exclusivity conditions in the contract. So they should be allowed to work for multiple clients during the same period, which is more likely that they are in business in their own right if they can manage their own time to deliver services for multiple clients. And the other thing you can do is to make sure the worker is not perceived to be part of your organization, so they don't look like they're part and parcel of your business. So don't give them any equipment. They should provide their own unless it's IT related for your own IT security. A quick win is to give them a different coloured lanyard to other members of staff so that visibly they look different. They shouldn't manage your staff. You shouldn't invite them to any staff functions, Christmas parties and the like. And you definitely should not provide them with any benefits in kind, no company cars, no access to your health insurance, etc. And finally, don't provide them with any training. They should be fully trained in what they're doing. They're bringing their skills to the table. You're not there to train them up. The only training you're allowed to give them is the mandatory health and safety. But apart from that, nothing else. Other factors that come into play are that you should not stipulate that the contractor has to be on site, if at all possible. They should be able to manage their own time and deliver the services off-site in their own time. I mean, most of us are working from home now, so that should be encouraged. Change the focus from a day rate to an agreed fee for the completion of a set of deliverables. You can, in this kind of fee schedule, have monthly retainers being drawn down until the end of that 6-month period. And it's also wise to remove any references to minimum number of hours expected to be delivered. So on to how we here at MTAX can help you. The contract and working conditions review is a must if you want to use HMRC Success tool effectively. What we found is that many contracts for services inadvertently contain references commonly used in employment contracts. And what we can do is go through your contracts. And these are sort of things we find commonly found in contracts for services. You should make sure you don't name the worker in the contract. It should be the name of their business. You shouldn't mention who their line manager is, because they should be managing themselves. There should be a clear end date and no lengthy notice periods. And try to avoid a set address as the work location, because as I said before, they should be able to provide the services from wherever, from their own premises, ideally. Include a description of services to be supplied, not a job title. They should not have a job title. They're not an employee. And avoid setting stipulated working hours. Again, they should be able to deliver the services in their own time. And definitely don't specify any overtime rates. That's a big indicator that this is a disguised employee. And here's a quick example of a sample contract that we did some work on earlier on, last year. And you can see the changes we've made on track changes. In paragraph 3.3, initially it said that the services, a substitute could be provided if the contractor was ill or injured, but that's not your business. They're not an employee. There's no reason to put that in there. It should be for any reason. And then in 3.4, it said that a substitute would only be accepted with the prior written approval of the client. Well, that's not, that points towards employment. There's too much control there. There's a level of personal service. They are saying you can provide the services. We changed that, that the contractor is able to supply a suitably qualified individual of their own choosing to the engager. And the engager would have to accept that person as long as they had the necessary skills and qualifications. So these are just areas which bolster the self-employed status. And most contracts we look at, we can add value to them. Next is the review of working conditions, because you need to find out what actually happens in practice. And this is a questionnaire that's filled out by project managers out in the field. So they could have a group of contractors who work towards them, and so they can say what's happened with that group of contractors. And literally that's enough for you to be able to form an SDS using HMRC system. Now, we can review the answers given and advise of new practices to maximize the number of people who are going to be outside of IR35. And the aim here is to devise a template for a statement of work to accompany the updated contract. And this statement of work, as I said, it's a template. You can change it as and when, depending what the next stage of the project is going to be. And this will basically contain the scope of work and the commercial arrangements, including how the fees are going to be paid, Normally, we advise that these are paid on the completion of certain tasks, certain deliverables, or at certain milestones. The time frame for the completion of that project is also going to be stipulated there, and also what you expect the deliverables are going to be. So that's a quick overview of how to get ready for IR35. Just a little bit of more information about us, if you don't know already. We are MTax. We are a small boutique employment tax consultancy comprising of tax professionals who work both within HMRC as employer compliance inspectors and also within the Big Four. So we've done it from both sides. We've been going for this our 9th year of trading now, and we can provide you with affordable employment tax consultancy, not just for dealing with IR35 reforms, but for any area of employment taxation. Now, to specifically help you getting ready for IR35, firstly, we have prepared a due diligence checklist, which someone in finance, can go through the supplier list and tick off certain key questions, which you can do with a little bit of research on the internet. You can find out whether or not that person requires an SDS or not, or that entity, because it's not always apparent who your personal service companies are. And HMRC will expect to see this kind of exercise being undertaken if they ever decide to do a spot check on you. So if you can answer certain questions, that entity is not a personal service company, and you can just need to file away that particular questionnaire in the supplier folder, and then you can prove to HMRC you've done that exercise. Another area we can help you with is writing communication emails to your contractors, just telling them what the changes are, how they may be affected. If they turn out to be employees, this is what's going to happen. If they're going to be self-employed, what information they should be keeping to maintain that status, what record, etc. they should be doing, keeping hold of. So that's also quite valuable, writing bespoke communication emails to your contractors themselves. But most importantly, we have got the know-how to update your contract and help you build these IR35 procedures so that they're robust enough for you to continue with them moving forwards. Okay. So on to questions. We've got a couple of questions. If you've got any questions at all, feel free to ask them now. I'm just going to go through them now. Okay, yes, you can. We'll get a copy of these slides. They will be forwarded to you later on this week. Nicola Hales has got a question. Do we know yet if HMRC have a specialist helpline, a web chat for this topic for employers? They wanted to, and they would have done if it wasn't for COVID. I think they're just completely flat out dealing with furlough and all the other stuff associated with COVID. Even their compliance, the compliance has ceased because they're working to keep people getting paid, etc. So at this moment in time, there's no specialist helpline. There's meant to be one coming on board. I don't know what their plans are at this moment in time, but at this moment in time, no. Is it likely to be delayed again? Anne's asking because of COVID. Who knows? You have to appreciate they have to start clawing money in at some point. You know, they've borrowed so much. So I suppose it all depends on how the vaccinations go. I was surprised last time, so it could be delayed, but I doubt it. I don't think they can keep kicking it into long grass. This is going to have to happen at some point. I think this April, you know, it's odds on that it will go ahead. Okay. Any more questions? I'll just leave our contact details there. If you need to contact us for any reason, feel free, contact us there. Before you go, there's a quick poll here. It's only a few questions. If you'd just like to answer those, would be grateful. I'll leave that up there for a minute or two. Okay. But feel free to drop us an email if you need any more help with the IR35, etc., and or give us a ring. I'll be more than happy to help. Okay then. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning. Hope it's been helpful to you, and hopefully we'll be in touch with some of you shortly. Okay, thank you then. Have a good day.